Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with host Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you never miss an episode. Search for us on your favorite podcast app, or you can find the podcast on jimmyhinton.org and findingahealingplace.com. Please rate our show, subscribe, and share so we can spread the word. If you would like to support us and get exclusive rewards, go to patreon.com/speakingout. Find a tier that best fits you and join as a patron of the podcast. Now let's get into the show. Welcome to this week's podcast with hosts Jimmy Hinton
and Jimmy's mom, Clara.
This week, on this episode, we are going to talk about the shortage of ministers. There's a big shortage right now. It's been going on for a while, actually. But the question is the shortage of ministers, preaching pastors, whatever terminology you have for them, is this shortage fueling abuse? We're going to unfold that and unpack that in this episode.
That'll
Welcome to episode 112.
Can you believe that?
I know. Over 100.
Yes.
Man,
I
that's
know.
exciting.
I just told somebody yesterday, and they said, "What? 100?" I said, "Yeah, 112 coming up. It's awesome."
So we'll give our thank you to the patrons. Thank you to the patrons who support this podcast and make this possible. If you'd like to become a patron, go to patreon.com/speakingout. I'm over here drinking my coffee. We both talked. We have family coming in town.
We already have some family in town, and this lady was up 3/4 of the night talking with them. Yeah.
Yesterday was a busy day for me. So anyway, okay. Let's talk about the problem of the shortage right now. Here are some contributing factors that are going on, just to put your finger on the pulse of what's going on around the country. First and foremost, retirement. Many ministers going into retirement right now. Right. Tom Rainer has some good stuff on that, some good statistics. In fact, I'm going to pull up real quickly. This is an article by Tom Rainer this is from 2019, January last year, Mega Pastoral Vacancies in Mega Churches. There are these big vacancies, and he talks about these bullet points. How did we get here? And by the way, it's not just mega churches. I
was going to say
small churches especially are seeing shortages.
Excuse me with the allergies. In ministry for close to 40 years with your dad, I know way back when small rural churches had always a shortage.
Yeah, it's gotten much worse. Yeah. Much worse now.
And I know that in this segment, we're going to touch on a lot of those reasons why also.
Yeah. So here are some of the reasons he gives for mega churches. He says, point one, they have similar profiles of the type of pastor they want, and there aren't many that meet that profile. So they want somebody between the ages of 38 and 49. They have to currently be serving at a church with attendance of at least 500. Dynamic preaching is a given. Doctoral degrees are preferred. He said, and the candidate has to be happily married with 2.6 children. Point number two, the number of millennials who are in vocational ministry and meet the profile is small. Number three, fewer millennials are excited about leading a mega church. They don't like these big, massive churches. They'd rather have the small group, intimate settings.
Yes.
Millennials are concerned about the large worship centers many megachurches have, and he talks about why. They build these massive mega structures, and they have these really tiny, they're not filled to capacity. They have these tiny
gatherings,
groups.
And I think the home churches or the community type church now is catching on. It's igniting, and people
crave
like
community.
They do. Sure.
So, with these big structures being empty, it just gives this kind of dismal feel.
It's a hollow feeling.
Yeah. And then many search committees or the equivalent try to look for a pastor in the old traditional path. That's interesting too. These old traditional churches are being sparked back up again. A lot of people
Mhm.
going back to, a lot of young people going back
Yeah.
to really traditional
Roots.
churches.
Yes, they are.
And then finally, many mega churches do not have a succession plan. They're not training people to take over
Right.
ministry, and
Mhm.
it's this, glamour behind it, this power and um, reputation. You try to hunt for people who have the best reputation and they're really popular and
Well, charisma,
yep,
they have to be.
charismatic.
Yes.
Hmm.
Oh,
Yeah,
absolutely. Absolutely. And um, they have to be somewhat of a puppet to those in charge. Should I
yeah.
put it that way?
Well, an image is really important
Image
too.
is huge. It's
So you have to
huge.
maintain this really
Hmm.
important, prolific image, or else your church
Talk about
ceases to
pressure.
exist.
Think about that in the wrong
Yeah.
ways.
Hmm.
Pressure in the
Right.
wrong ways. Yeah.
So yeah, retirement. More people going into retirement now than ever before in ministry. Bivocational. A lot of people now, due to COVID, are getting second jobs because
Sure.
of survival.
I don't think it's just due to COVID. And maybe in the mega churches, the pay is great, but historically, pastoral pay is
Yeah.
not great
Yeah.
at all.
Yeah. Interestingly, the majority of churches, I think it's over 80% of churches, have an attendance of 100 or less. So if you
That's
think about their budgets in
right.
these churches,
Yeah.
and I'm at a church of
Mhm.
100 or less,
Right.
and our budget is tight. Let's just say
Yeah.
I'm not rolling in a bed made of money. I'm
No.
not in it for the money. Trust me
No.
when I say that.
And that's the majority of what you're talking
Yeah.
about. So that also that doesn't make being a pastor in a church real appealing.
No, I
at
mean
all.
you work a lot.
You're on call 24/7.
The
most of
expectations are
time.
really high.
Yes, they
And
are.
I can say personally, if my wife wasn't
Mhm.
working full time, financially, we wouldn't make it
No.
on my income.
Right.
There's no
and
way.
that's true for most pastors.
Right.
Yeah, pastor families.
So yeah, bivocational, especially now because of COVID,
Right.
which has taken less time away from the church, and they're basically part-time preachers
Right.
with a full-time expectation.
Right.
Less and less people are going into ministry at all. It's, to be quite honest, it's not very appealing
Well,
to go
it
into
isn't.
ministry.
And also, think about this, Jimmy, with all the things that go on now, nothing is hidden. I mean, not that it should be, but you know what I'm saying?
Try as they might, though. Yeah, people aren't
But
allowing
what?
things to be hidden.
How can I put this? What you've done in high school is at some time going to appear
Mhm.
by someone. It's like, wow, with social media and with everybody talks about everything. And I hate using the terms everybody, everything, but it's
Yeah.
true.
Yeah.
You get picked apart anymore.
Yeah.
Really picked apart.
Yeah.
And so if you don't have a squeaky clean background, who
Mhm.
wants to put themselves on the chopping block like that?
Yeah.
Publicly.
Yeah. I mean, which I think is it's a good thing for accountability. But yeah, I mean, the reality is, a lot of people are scared off by that.
Well, they sure are. They're
and
thinking
and
about,
that's just where
oh
we're
man, I went to this one party when I was 17. Is that going to come up? And it probably will at
Yeah.
some point. And they know it. So it's not a real appealing to be a public figure.
at. No. And I think this one is my own. This has just been my observation, but a lack of training on two of the
Mhm.
most common things that a church will face is driving ministers away, which probably is a good thing because they just don't know what to do with this. But the two most common things that a church will face are trauma
Right.
and church conflict.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Always.
And people aren't trained
Always. No.
how to deal with either one of those, or to even
Mhm.
acknowledge that they
No.
exist.
Mhm.
And so these ministers, when they're faced with trauma, when somebody comes forward and says, "I have trauma in my life. I've been abused. I have some form of trauma in my life," they don't know what to do,
No.
and and that in itself can create conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And even without trauma, there's always church conflict.
Always. Yeah.
And they don't know how to manage it. They don't know what to
Mm-hmm.
do with that. And they don't know how to have conversations and how to negotiate and how to be a peacemaker. I fortunately had a class on church conflict that was excellent.
Mm-hmm. I remember you talking about that.
But a lot of people don't.
Yeah, right.
It wasn't a required
No.
course. That was an elective.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw that course and I was like, I definitely want to learn how to deal with church conflict, but it wasn't required in the Master of Divinity program.
When you think about it, the pastor of a church faces these things weekly.
Every day.
Yeah.
Every day.
Yes, really.
You face conflict.
Yes. And I can see why a church is looking for someone a little older, more experienced in life.
Mm-hmm.
But think of the consequences also without a pastor to lead the church. It's a shame. It's a double-edged sword that leaves the members just in a mess.
But we've kind of created that. I mean, we've not mentored or trained our lay members. We've basically said, leave it to the professionals. We're going to hire professional ministers. We're going to put them on the payroll, and the rest of you lay people, it's
been done all wrong.
You just sit here,
sit back,
and enjoy the show. Mm-hmm. Especially at a lot of the mega churches, they've developed this consumeristic worship service where you go and it's just this production. It's this huge production.
It's a production, and it's a follow the leader.
Yeah,
we'll lead you.
Churches are built around personalities.
Yes.
Instead of talent.
I have always said that from years and years and years ago. If you have the right personality, you can swing a church to do anything.
Which is dangerous.
To believe anything.
Yeah, especially for abuse.
It is extremely dangerous, yes.
So why does this shortage matter? Here are three main points that we have. Why the shortage matters. Number one, churches are desperate to select and retain preachers. And you know where this is going.
I do.
It's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah. Yep.
Because they turn more of a blind eye to abusive patterns, and then their theology of grace and mercy has to increase. I really think that's where this hyper grace theology started from. Is that churches saw leaders behaving very badly, and nobody in their right mind can excuse that behavior. At least at the onset.
Right.
You can't defend it.
No.
You can't defend bad behavior from one of your church leaders. So they started to bend their theology and say, well, look at these passages on grace and mercy, and totally pulled them out of context. Mm-hmm. And now you have these hyper grace churches that turn a blind eye to abuse if it's their leader. But interestingly, if their church members speak up about abuse, grace and mercy fly out the window.
Yep, kick them out.
Yep.
Get rid of them.
And Boz Javidjian talks about this. He said that churches position themselves towards grace and mercy when it's a leader, and law towards their members. So it's the letter of the law for their members, but it's grace and mercy for their leaders.
Well, think about it. When the members get stirred up, it upsets the whole apple cart.
Yeah, and leaders take it personally.
Well,
they get their feelings hurt.
And something has to be done. I mean, think about it. When you stir the pot, something has to be done. When a leader is in that predicament, it's easier to extend grace and mercy, say, well, he was young, he didn't know better, he didn't have enough life experience. We need to overlook this because we're in training, we're teaching,
And after all, aren't leaders supposed to be the model, the example that we give to the rest of the people of mercy and grace? It's this convoluted idea.
I see how topsy-turvy this works. And it is.
Number two point why the shortage matters. Abusers are always searching for the path of least resistance. If
Oh,
you don't
yeah.
think that abusers are researching and finding churches that are
Mhm.
desperate
Sure.
for leaders, and they'll position themselves, because it's what abusers do,
Yes.
they'll position themselves in a way where they're at the right place at the right time, and it's where the church feels like, my goodness, this is a gift from God.
Well, you know,
What perfect timing that this guy just showed up on our doorstep with an
uh,
application in hand.
when I'm thinking, what did your dad do? When he went into part-time ministry, became a traveling minister, so to speak, he was always searching for churches that were desperate to hire
Yes.
someone. And he interviewed well. I mean, here
Yeah.
is this kind gentleman, middle-aged, father of all these children who are
Mhm.
Christian children. He, all went to college, Christian colleges, and he was the perfect person.
Oh, he was
Oh,
overqualified,
yeah.
you know?
Perfect. And he didn't demand a lot of money. He didn't
Nope.
even ask. I mean, he would gladly do this for very little
Mhm.
money. Very little.
Yeah.
He was the perfect person. The
Yeah.
perfect
They
fit
always
in.
are.
Yes. And that's what he needed. And he's not alone.
No.
They're out there.
And point number 3, the final point in this one, I think is probably the most important. But you have elders, deacons, elder boards, whatever your leadership structure is there. They prioritize authority over accountability. And this just fuels a toxic, abusive atmosphere. They talk about how they've been given this authority by God. They prioritize authority and, in effect, become authoritarian leaders, where the letter of the law comes directly from those leaders, and anybody else who dissents or has an opinion that's contrary to what they believe, they're shouted down, they're stopped, they're threatened, they're kicked out of the church. And it creates this incredibly abusive atmosphere where an abuser can come in.
Oh, it's perfect.
And an authoritarian leadership
Perfect.
is appealing to them,
Perfect.
ironically.
Perfect. Yeah. Perfect.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, in other words, if a minister is an abuser, victims are met with more abuse from other leaders who are authoritarian, and they're abusive as well. And then this cycle of abuse is all but guaranteed at the churches with this kind of leadership structure.
Just shake my head, because that's how the churches, I think, became such playgrounds for abuse.
Mars Hill, Willow Creek, what's James McDonald's church? It's slipping my mind right now, but
because I can't remember your name most days.
all of these churches, all of these big brand, big name churches, they have this toxic leadership where they're a band of brothers, and they all stick together, unless somebody within that leadership challenges them, and then they eat them up and devour them and spit them out, and then that they keep this band of brothers that's untouchable. Nobody from the church can tear it down.
Well, think about in the smaller churches too, Jimmy, where there isn't a strong leadership, where there may be no elders, appointed elders or deacons. The minister is it. He is the pope of the church. So
absolutely.
And he knows it. And he can be as abusive as he wants, because who's going to do anything about it?
Yeah. And he will gain and position himself with more authority.
Oh, yeah.
And there's zero accountability.
Zero. And that's dangerous.
Yeah.
Dangerous.
So when you hear that kind of language, I wrote a blog post about this probably a couple years ago now, but it was something like, "Dear church leaders, you don't have the authority that you think you have." And I just laid that out biblically and showed it is not even alluded to in Scripture,
but
that these people have that amount of power, that they have, or really any power, authority, that's not even.
But when we go back, when we think about this historically, that's how things are. We know how it came about. And members are just now getting the courage, some, to speak out
Mm-hmm.
and to speak up and to challenge
Yeah.
that person or persons in charge. I know for myself, I was taught from little up, don't you ever challenge that preacher up there,
Mm-hmm.
ever.
Yeah.
He's the one, he's the man of God.
Yeah.
And you don't challenge that person.
Yeah.
So that belief has carried on, and it's still a strong
Absolutely,
thing.
it is. Yep, it
Very
sure
strong.
is. So, what do church leaders do about it? If there are any church leaders listening who have any ounce of common sense, and that they're out there, that's not a derogatory thing.
No.
You guys are out there. I train at churches that have really common sense leaders. So I'm not poking fun here. I really mean that. If there's anybody listening here who's a church leader and you're stuck at one of these churches with these abusive cycles, I would say number one, get rid of authoritarian leaders. Call it out. I've had to do this before. It's risky. It's they'll make your life a living hell. But I don't sit back and take that kind of crap where people are like, the buck stops with us, and we're the final authority, and I don't work with that kind of leadership, because
that's not good leadership.
When I hear it,
right.
When I see it, I call it out. Leadership is a team, and it's just authoritarian leaders have no place in the church. Get rid of them. And do it unapologetically. Number two, be patient rather than hire someone will be a problem. We recently in a smaller group talked about Brian Loritz at Summit Church. J.D. Greer's church, they hired Brian Loritz, and I don't know what in the world they were thinking, how they thought that was a good idea. But if you don't know Brian Loritz and what his background is, just look it up. Just Google search Brian Loritz.
And you're so right. I think sometimes churches think they need to put a body behind the pulpit just to have that body behind the pulpit. And they hire just the wrong person.
Yeah.
And they know it.
Yeah.
They know it. And they hope that person will grow to fit into that role. And unless that person is grounded in God's word, and that's got to be. And it's funny that list of things that we addressed earlier, I didn't see anything really that stood out that said must be grounded in the word of God.
Yeah, no, not at all.
Must be happily married and have 2.6 children. Must be between the ages of blah, blah, blah. Nothing stood out to me.
It's all outward appearance.
Outward appearance. Nothing stood out to me about being grounded on the foundation of God's truth.
Yeah.
Should that not be?
How about this as a prerequisite for ministers?
Wow.
Don't have scandals in your past, right? Or in your life.
I absolutely
Don't have scandals.
I think that's going
Don't
to
be
be
abusive. Don't be authoritarian. Right? Those are not prerequisites.
No.
In fact, I'll say this personally.
No.
I won't name the churches because it doesn't matter. But in the last 3 years, I've had at least 3 or 4 churches that have contacted me. All of them were out of state. And they said, you're the first person that we're looking at. We will probably do an interview, but that would just be a formality. You're a shoo-in. And I was like,
crazy.
That's nuts.
Crazy, isn't it? It is, yeah.
But
that's how it's done a lot.
Absolutely.
Out of desperation.
Yeah.
Desperation to fill that
I mean,
spot.
you're desperate when you're getting Jimmy Hinton.
No, I didn't mean that. But I mean it when you don't care to meet the person, to interview them, to find out who they are and what they're about. That's scary.
Right.
That's scary.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Terrible.
But I mean, I can tell you that personally,
Terrible.
and that happens all the time.
Yeah, I know that.
Where people are contacted.
Scary.
Because, I have friends at different churches, or some of them, they've just heard about me, and they're like, we like what we hear. You're a shoo-in. I've been told that. You're a shoo-in.
This is, without doubt, when you're working with a church, when you're working with spiritual matters, the spiritual lives of people, the utmost, most important job that you can have, aside from being a Christian husband and father in the home.
Yeah.
And I believe that with all my heart. And we should be meticulous with who fills that spot.
Yeah.
Meticulous in the fact that if they are not speaking God's word and teaching God's word correctly, that's horrid.
Not just teaching, living it.
Living it.
If they're not living their lives right.
But or cannot handle, as you said, the trauma that comes when a person comes forth and they're bleeding. You've made that reference before, like somebody going to the hospital, they have a gunshot wound or something and they need help. You're not going to sit there and just kind of look at it and say, you know.
I mean, the two most common scenarios with that metaphor is the ER doctor who's clueless and is like, my God, I don't know what to do. Or the opposite is you get shouted out. Why would you come here? Why would you bring this up now?
Right.
This happened 20 minutes ago, and you're just now coming to the ER?
Here.
And, you know, why would you come here?
Yep.
Why would you bring this up to me?
Great analogy, yeah.
Okay, so what else can church leaders do? Be wise in your decision. That's what you were just talking about. Be more meticulous, be wise, think through the questions that you're going to ask and the candidate who you're looking for. Be wise in that. And then finally, point number 4, let some of your members be forced to preach or mentor them to do so. You don't have to have a hired person in the pulpit for your church to exist. The world will go on. Your church will go on. Get some of the people to temporarily step up and
That's
say...
almost a panic. I can almost feel it in the air because I've been in churches where that's happened before and people panic. We don't have a preacher. We don't have a full-time preacher, you know, and there's a panic.
Yeah.
We don't need to panic.
No. Because when you panic, you make really poor decisions and you put people in who have a pulse. And
I have a saying, and it holds true all the time, no matter the situation. Desperate people do desperate things.
Yeah.
Always.
Yeah.
Always. And when we feel desperate, that's when we pick up the phone and say, hey, Jimmy, we need a preacher. Would you consider?
Yeah.
You know, we know. We've heard about you. Really? Never met Jimmy. You don't really know. You've not questioned him. You don't get a feel for him. But that's desperate people do very desperate things.
Yeah. Okay, then finally, what do church members do? What can they do about this problem? Because it is fueling abuse. That question was really rhetorical. Is the shortage of ministers fueling abuse? Absolutely.
Well, sure it is. Yeah.
We can see that all over the place. Okay, so what do church members do about it? They can call out authoritarian leaders. Don't be afraid to call them out. I mean, they're going to make your life a living hell, don't get me wrong. But one of my questions here is, what's the worst thing that they can do to you? Don't be intimidated. That's point number 2. I'm reordering these. But point number 2, don't be intimidated by leaders. When they threaten you, tell them to go pound dirt.
Very few people who will do this, though, Jimmy, in reality.
Yeah.
Very few want to do that. They'd rather stay away, myself included. I don't like conflict. I
don't either.
Especially within the confines of a church family. I just don't like it. And sadly, I'll do anything to stay away from it.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people understand where I'm coming from. They don't like conflict.
No.
And it's been very rare that I've ever said something to a church leader that could be close to being calling out an authoritarian leader. And it was not fun.
Yeah.
Really
now, I want to make a really important clarification here, because I don't want to contribute to this toxic culture that's going on right now. What's happening to our cops in the nation right now is disgusting.
Yeah, it is.
Yes. There was just an article yesterday there was a police officer who the guy, a worker at a fast food restaurant or at a Dunkin' Donuts, got arrested because the cop found a big hard chunk of mucus in his coffee. That's insane. What people are doing to police in this nation is disgusting. It's gross. It's criminal. It's unethical. It's sick. The things that I have friends of mine posting about police on their timelines, it's gross. It's disgusting. It's sick. It shouldn't happen.
Wrong. It's just, everything.
So
about it is wrong.
I don't want to contribute to this culture of shouting and screaming in the face of people just because you think it's your First Amendment right to do so. That's pathetic. That's a pathetic excuse for people being idiots.
There's a proper way of doing of bringing this to someone's attention or saying, "Hey."
Well, and I want to make the distinction too. I'm not talking about leaders who you disagree with.
Right.
There could be leaders who, on the onset, at first, they're like, "Well, we think that we should handle abuse this way," and it could be totally wrong, but that leader could be somebody who's willing to listen.
Right.
I'm not talking about not being intimidated by them or calling those leaders out. Have a discussion with leaders who will have a discussion with you. There are leaders out there who make really bad decisions, but they're just uninformed, and they will listen to you, and they will pull up a chair and they'll let you have a conversation with them. For those leaders, extend grace and mercy to them and have those conversations with them. But when a leader's being authoritarian, when they say, "Well, the buck stops with me," and and they're putting you in their place or they're intimidating
the abusive
you.
Leader. That's what you're talking about. The leader who is exercising abuse on those within the congregation. Yeah, absolutely.
I would say another point, third point, what can church members do? Insist on having a say in who's hired. Right. Don't let your leaders, don't let them either themselves or hire or get a volunteer committee where they have these closed door meetings and have absolutely no information that they give to the congregation. And all of a sudden they say, here's your new minister. Don't let them do it.
As I think about these mega churches, I'm sure, those are committees that interview and that do the hiring. And sometimes you really don't have a say.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of small churches do it too. Or they do these really quick, sneaky, forced votes, congregational votes, where you're like, wait, what? What just happened?
Yeah.
Don't let them do it.
Yeah.
If they're trying to jam something through,
it's tough.
Don't let them do it. As members, you have every right to speak up. Do it in a respectful way, but speak up. Let them know what's on your mind. And then the next point, don't allow known abusers to preach undetected. If you know that an abuser is in the pulpit, again, don't let authoritarian leaders intimidate you. Speak up. Tell people.
I think we've had several podcasts now, I don't know, but at least 3, about this very thing. When there is a person in the pulpit who is known to have been abusive, that you have every right to alert other members of the congregation.
Yeah, and that's not gossip.
And no, that is not gossip.
If you have firsthand information and you know.
Right, and you know
that's
it
not
is
gossip.
a fact. Right, it is not gossip, and that needs to be known among the flock.
Yeah.
And I think the biggest take from this is that we have a responsibility, those of us who are church members, we have a very important responsibility to make sure the truth and that right things are being done from that place of the pulpit. That's our responsibility. Yeah. And, there's a right way and a wrong way of doing that, but we have every reason to alert other members of someone who's abusive in that position.
Yeah, definitely.
Without feeling guilty or that we're stirring up any kind of trouble.
The last point, what can church members do? Think about starting a house church or an online church or attending an online church, but be involved. Don't let a church's bad decisions about hiring somebody affect
your relationship with God.
Your relationship with God, with other people.
Yeah.
Because it's going to happen. I think it's going to happen probably with more frequency now that there's such I mean, it is a crisis. And Tom Rainer says, he says at this point, he says, I'm borderline whether I want to call it a crisis, but he said, if we keep doing what we're doing, it will be a crisis very quickly.
Right.
I would probably go that far to say that it is a crisis.
You know what's sad too, when you think of it, I mean, either way, with the wrong person in the pulpit or without someone in the pulpit, there's a crisis within the church because it just leaves a lot of leeway for sexual abuse within the church. It really does. When there's no leadership or not good leadership, just think of what that person can do within the church.
But really all kinds of abuse. I mean, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, spiritual abuse, physical abuse.
Yes.
I mean, it's just, you just open a Pandora's box.
And it's very sad. And then you have people who get very discouraged with God instead of with the situation, and they pull away from God and just throw their hands up and say, if this is what God and worship is all about, I don't want anything to do with it.
Yeah.
When really this is the crisis. This is the situation.
Yeah.
What we're talking about.
Yeah.
So,
well, we'll leave you with this truth bomb. We are facing a crisis, and the problem will only get worse. That is a fact. Prepare to hold leaders accountable and change the way that we do church. Be open to that. The face of the church is changing, and it's changing rapidly. And we need to, now more than ever before, adhere to our faith and hold people accountable and place accountability above authority. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for tuning into this episode, and we'll catch you next round.
Thanks again for listening to today's episode. Thank you to our patrons who make the podcast possible. If you found it helpful, please follow on Spreaker and search for the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast in your favorite podcast app. Be sure to hit subscribe and rate the show. If you believe in what we do, consider supporting the podcast by becoming a patron, and check out the cool rewards our patrons receive. Share with your friends and tell the world. Join us in speaking out on sex abuse so we can change the tides and prevent abuse.